Hey heroes, and welcome to another amazing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an event of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Last week on the channel, we talked about a deadly vigilante known as the Scourge of the Underworld. To briefly recap, the Scourge identity itself was largely the brainchild of two men. An independently wealthy old man named Thomas Halloway, who decades prior fought crime as a costumed adventurer known as the Angel, and a well-connected investigator and informant named Dominic Dunsinane, aka Domino. Believing that the emergence of modern supercriminals required a lethal response, Halloway and Dunsinane created the Scourge Program, in which like-minded individuals were recruited and trained, becoming brutal vigilantes who used a mastery of disguise to hide in plain sight and take their targets unawares. The first and most infamous Scourge made his debut by murdering the enforcer Charles Delasny before embarking on a prolific killing spree, ultimately culminating in a historic attack on the Bar with No Name that resulted in the deaths of 18 supervillains. In the wake of that attack, that Scourge was apprehended and unmasked by Captain America, but he recounted a phony backstory, falsely claiming that he was the Enforcer's brother, and was ultimately shot and killed by a second Scourge before he could be interrogated further. In the aftermath of all that, the Scourge program seemed to lay low for a time, as no new deaths were attributed to them over the next few months. At some point, however, the infamous Nazi war criminal, the Red Skull, evidently learned of the program and successfully recruited at least one Scourge agent to employ as an assassin against other villains. Now, it's unclear exactly how long this Scourge was active for, but his first confirmed target was Albert Malik, the Soviet agent who impersonated the Red Skull in the 1950s. You may recall that we talked about him a bit in our video on William Burnside, the unauthorized Captain America who emerged in 1953 alongside his own Bucky, Jack Monroe. After more than one defeat at the hands of Burnside and Monroe, Malik relocated to Algeria, where he spent decades secretly building up a massive criminal empire. As a bit of a side note, about a dozen or so years before the Marvel Age began, Malik discovered that two of his employees, Richard and Mary Parker, were actually double agents working for the CIA. He tasked his right-hand man, Carl Fears, aka the Finisher, with eliminating the Parkers, and so in a sense Albert Malik was ultimately responsible for the deaths of Peter Parker's parents. In any event, years later, Malik was finally apprehended by the avenging archer Hawkeye, a French mercenary known as Le Peregrine, and the reformed criminal Sandman, all on the behalf of the Simkarian mercenary company Silver Sable International. Even after being sent to an Algerian prison, however, Malik continued to scheme and even sent a team of mercenaries to attack the original Red Skull, Johann Schmidt. Suffice it to say that didn't exactly work out, and Schmidt even recruited one of the would-be assassins, Brock Rumlow, who later became his costumed agent, Crossbones. In the meantime, the Red Skull tasked his Scourge with eliminating his communist counterpart, and when members of Malik's criminal organization attempted to free him from prison, Scourge impersonated and replaced the getaway pilot, killing Malik before he ever reached his destination. We'll loop back around to that Scourge in a bit, but first we need to touch on several other characters, starting with the criminal entrepreneur Curtis Jackson, better known as the Power Broker. We've talked about him on the channel before, so we'll keep it brief here, but longtime viewers may recall that as the power broker, Jackson ran a business that offered to endow individuals with superhuman strength by subjecting them to a battery of chemical and radiation treatments. What his customers didn't know, of course, was that the efficacy of these treatments depended on the genetic compatibility of the subject, and about half of its recipients were monstrously mutated. One of his successful customers, however, was a former soldier by the name of John F. Walker, who used his newly acquired superhuman strength to become a costumed crusader known as the Super Patriot. We'll actually come back to both Walker and Jackson in a bit, but for the next part of our story we must turn our attention to a woman named Priscilla Lyons. Originally from Gary, Indiana, Priscilla had a brother named Phil who was disowned by their parents, Edward and Vivian Lyons, after Phil left home to work in the drug trade, ultimately getting involved with the Miami-based drug lord Ulysses X. Lugman, better known as the Slug. Hoping to find her brother and convince him to leave the illicit business, Priscilla Lyons began hitchhiking southward, and as she passed through Kentucky, she encountered the aforementioned Jack Monroe, the imposter Bucky who clashed with Albert Malik in the 1950s. You may recall from previous videos that between the 1950s and the Marvel Age, Monroe spent decades in suspended animation, which is why he was still youthful. And maybe we'll talk more about Jack Monroe another day, but for now we'll just note that during this time, he had allied himself with the real Captain America, Steve Rogers, and adopted the costumed identity of Nomad. After hearing Priscilla's story, Monroe brought her to Florida and tracked her brother to the Slug's private yacht, but Phil had no interest in returning and drugged Monroe with a dose of heroin before having him thrown overboard. Fortunately for Jack, Priscilla contacted Steve Rogers, who arrived in time to save him. As Nomad, Monroe attempted to take down Lugman and started a fire that destroyed his yacht, but the Slug ultimately survived and escaped, as did Phil Lyons. After that, Priscilla Lyons decided to stay with Nomad, donning a masked identity of her own and becoming known as a Vagabond, as the two started dating. Meanwhile, there was an incident in which Steve Rogers chose to step down from the role of Captain America rather than become a government stooge. In the wake of this, the Commission on Superhuman Activities, or CSA, chose another man to become the new Captain America, none other than the Super Patriot himself, John Walker. Shortly after that, Nomad and Vagabond joined forces with two more of Steve's allies, Sam Wilson, the Falcon, and Dennis Dunphy, the Demolition Man, or D-Man for short. We've mentioned Dunphy on the channel before as well, so you may recall that he was also a successful recipient of the Power Broker's strength-augmenting treatments, who previously used them to participate in the Unlimited Class Wrestling Federation. Anyway, Nomad, Vagabond, Falcon, and D-Man ultimately tracked down Steve Rogers and convinced him to go back into action, providing him with a new black costume. Donning this new suit, Rogers became known simply as the Captain and fought alongside his allies. Vagabond, however, didn't have any superhuman powers or combat training, and so Rogers generally kept her on the sidelines. Furthermore, her boyfriend Nomad never seemed to have any time to train her, and so instead she turned to her other ally, Dennis Dunphy, who showed her some wrestling moves and taught her how to fight. As a result, she was able to help on occasion, at one point saving the life of the teleporting criminal Sidewinder. Nomad, meanwhile, mistook Dennis and Priscilla's friendly relationship as a flirtatious one and grew jealous, evidently unaware that D-Man was gay. This whole situation came to a head after both Nomad and D-Man were arrested and imprisoned by the CSA. It is worth noting that during this time, the CSA chairman Douglas Rockwell was secretly working for the Red Skull, allowing the Skull to exert some influence over the Commission's decisions. Owed a favor, Vagabond convinced Sidewinder to use his teleporting powers to help her infiltrate the CSA holding facility and to rescue her allies. D-Man, however, decided to stay behind and serve out his sentence, and Vagabond wound up staying with him. Annoyed, Nomad broke off his relationship with Vagabond and escaped with Sidewinder, leaving his two allies behind. This brings us back to where we left off, because it was shortly after all this that the Red Skull sent his Scourge to kill Albert Malik. As part of another scheme, the Red Skull subsequently gathered a number of costumed agents, including Scourge, and lured the replacement Captain America, John Walker, into a trap. In the ensuing battle, Walker defeated his attackers, badly battering and even killing many of them, although Scourge survived. Meanwhile, Rogers, as the captain, investigated the corrupt CSA head, Douglas Rockwell, who was quickly killed by the Red Skull to silence him. We don't need to go into all the details here, but this whole situation culminated in a battle between Walker and Rogers, just as the Red Skull intended, but in the end the villain's schemes were exposed and the Skull was forced to flee. In the aftermath of all that, Walker ultimately convinced Steve Rogers to return to the role of Captain America, giving the shield back to him in a CSA press conference, during which Walker was seemingly assassinated by a member of the far-right domestic terrorist group, the Watchdogs. In truth, Walker's assassination was actually a ruse orchestrated by General Lewis Hayworth of the CSA as part of a plan to fake Walker's death. The supposed watchdog was actually just a disguised government employee, but soon after he was shot and killed by the same Scourge of the Underworld that worked for the Red Skull. While the world thought him dead, Walker was given a new civilian identity as Jack Daniels, and soon returned to government service, donning a costume with the same design as Rogers' black captain suit while taking the new codename USAgent. Meanwhile, after being released from CSA custody, Priscilla Lyons returned home to Indiana and learned that her brother had died, supposedly from a drug overdose. Feeling guilty about abandoning her quest to find him, Lyons wanted to take revenge on the kind of people who had lured her brother into a life of crime to begin with. Hoping to gain the strength necessary to do so, she traveled to Los Angeles and met with Curtis Jackson, the power broker. At the same time, however, the Scourge Program also set their sights on the power broker, and one of their agents launched an attack on the elusive Jackson's home, killing many employees as he fought his way inside. For those keeping track of the various Scourges, this one is the same Scourge who killed the Wraith, Brian DeWolf, and executed his predecessor, the First Scourge. As such, he has been referred to as the Second Scourge, although that might not technically be accurate. In any case, the power broker was also evidently a special contractor for the aforementioned General Hayworth, and so USAgent was dispatched to protect Jackson. While Walker clashed with Scourge, Jackson and Lyons fled down to the lab beneath the estate, where Jackson, fearing for his life, decided to undergo the augmentation process himself. Ironically, however, Jackson's own genetics were incompatible with the power broker process, and as a result his muscles ballooned to gargantuan proportions, making his limbs too heavy to move under their own strength. In the end, Scourge reached the lab and attempted to take Priscilla hostage, but she was able to free herself from his grasp, allowing USAgent to capture the killer. As Walker was taking his prisoner away, however, another agent from the program fired a shot that killed the second Scourge, just as the second had killed the first. In the wake of this incident, Curtis Jackson was taken into police custody and hospitalized. Meanwhile, his head scientist, Dr. Carl Malice, sought to use his condition as an opportunity to seize control of the company and sent his men to find and abduct Priscilla Lyons. Strapping an explosive bracelet to her wrist that contained a microphone and homing device, Malice tasked Lyons with getting a mold of Jackson's fingerprints so that he could use them to access his safe. Lyons ultimately accomplished this task but hid the mold, forcing Malice to remove the bracelet on her wrist before she retrieved it. And while Malice betrayed her by attempting to sedate her as she handed it over, Lyons was able to avoid his jab and knocked out the Twisted Doctor before destroying the mold and contacting USAgent, letting him know where to find Malice but leaving before he arrived. Having abandoned the idea of undergoing any sort of power augmentation herself, Lyons decided to leave town again, but after reaching the bus station, she was approached by a woman known as Caprice. If that name sounds familiar, it's because we briefly mentioned her last week, as she was the Scourge agent who impersonated Gold Digger to assassinate Titania. As it turns out, the Scourge Program had taken notice of Priscilla Lyons, and while it took some convincing, she ultimately agreed to join them. Over the following half a year, Lyons was subjected to an intense training regimen in which she gained proficiency in various martial arts, multiple types of firearms, surveillance techniques, escape artistry, lockpicking, safe cracking, and the art of disguise. This, of course, was overseen by the Scourge Program's head trainer, a man known only as Bloodstain. Now, I will note that during this time, the Scourge who worked for the Red Skull continued his operations, reportedly killing supervillains Black Abbot, Lion Fang, and Wrench, although of the three of these, only Black Abbot's death has been confirmed, and Lion Fang even resurfaced years later. Furthermore, this Scourge outright failed in his missions to eliminate three other targets: Shocker, Steelwind, and Gamecock. In the end, the Red Skull decided that this agent was doing more damage to Scourge's reputation than anything else, and elected to execute him with his red dust of death. Turning our attention back to Priscilla Lyons, after 6 months, her training culminated with an outdoor exercise in which she was required to tail another Scourge without being noticed for a full day. And accomplishing this task, Priscilla Lyons witnessed firsthand just how coldly and efficiently Scourge killings were typically carried out. Graduating from the program, the first target that Lyons was tasked with eliminating was Manuel Eleganto, aka the Matador, one of the first costumed villains to clash with the masked vigilante Daredevil. However, after tracking Eleganto to a poor neighborhood in Los Angeles, what she found wasn't a mad criminal plotting his next crime, but rather an ex-convict in the middle of babysitting his widowed sister's young children, a man who had kept out of trouble for years by that point. And so in the end, Lyons just couldn't go through with pulling the trigger, and fled, letting the former Matador live. Of course, Priscilla knew what happened to Scourges who failed in their missions, and sought to protect herself. To this end, she contacted USAgent, claiming that the Scourge of the Underworld had mistaken her for a supervillain known as Mysteria and was out to kill her. Soon enough, however, the truth came out, and Lyons ultimately explained who she really was and everything she knew about the Scourge Program. Meanwhile, another Scourge agent, a man identified only as Decker, completed a different mission by eliminating the obscure supervillain Peter Blowtorch Brand. Shortly after that, Lyons contacted Domino, claiming that she wanted another chance, while knowing that Decker would be sent to kill her. And sure enough, when Decker was sent to her location, he was defeated and captured by USAgent. Walker then brought both Decker and Lyons to the home of his acquaintance, Reverend Ned Nordstrom, before using Priscilla's Scourge equipment and makeup to impersonate Decker in an attempt to infiltrate the program. However, that plan quickly went sideways when the Scourge agent Caprice recognized him as an imposter, and Walker was chained up in a steam bath and interrogated by both Caprice and Bloodstain, while the heat made him increasingly delirious. Furthermore, with the scattered bits of information that they were able to get out of him, Domino was able to deduce USAgent's true identity. After that, Bloodstain impersonated John's deceased brother, Mike Walker, and falsely claimed that the Scourge Program was a CIA operation in the hopes of recruiting John. Letting him mull over the offer, Bloodstain then released a confused USAgent back onto the street, knowing that he would lead them back to Decker and Lyons. Donning their Scourge uniforms, Bloodstain and Caprice launched an attack on Reverend Nordstrom's home, and while Bloodstain succeeded in executing Decker for his failure, Lyons was able to defend herself against Caprice as the two women got into a scuffle. And so when Bloodstain tried to shoot Lyons, he inadvertently hit Caprice, giving Lyons the opportunity to return fire, hitting Bloodstain in the abdomen, albeit non-fatally. At the end of that firefight, Bloodstain escaped, but Walker and Lyons captured the wounded Caprice. By questioning her, Walker was able to track down the Scourge Program's organizer and investigator, Dominic Dunsinane, aka Domino, who in turn brought USAgent to the organization's elderly benefactor, Thomas Halloway, the former Angel. Halloway explained his motivations to Walker, however, Bloodstain disguised himself as Halloway's nurse and attempted to get the drop on USAgent, firing on the hero as he tried to hide among the angel statues in the garden of Halloway's estate. His spray of explosive bullets caused numerous statues to fall over, one of which landed on and killed Domino. In the end, when Walker tried to take down his attacker, some of the crazed killer's bullets bounced off of USAgent's shield, hitting Bloodstain in the head and chest, killing him. In the wake of that whole mess, Halloway was taken into custody, and while there wasn't enough actual evidence connecting him to Scourge for a conviction, with Bloodstain, Domino, and most of their notable agents dead, the program was in shambles and effectively rendered defunct. Despite this, the name and iconography of the Scourge of the Underworld would continue to be used by various others over the following years. For example, there was an incident in which the rogue CSA member Henry Peter Gyrick infected Jack Monroe with mind-controlling nanomachines, transforming him into a new incarnation of Scourge that wielded confiscated weapons from other supervillains. I talked about that a bit in my video on the Thunderbolts, so check that out for more details, and be sure to let me know in the comments if you'd like a video focusing on Jack Monroe himself. Later, during the Dark Reign, in which Norman Osborn was appointed the head of national security, Osborn transformed the government-sponsored Thunderbolts team into his own personal Black Ops squad, and recruited the blindly patriotic but mentally unwell cyborg soldier Frank Simpson, better known as Nuke. Wanting someone he could control for the job, Osborn soon put Nuke in charge of the Thunderbolts, but concealed his identity and had him adopt the code name Scourge. Sometime after that, there was an incident in which Hydra brainwashed the Demolition Man, Dennis Dunphy, transforming him into a version of Scourge that systematically targeted supervillains in the Witness Protection Program, with the assistance of government agent Henry Peter Gyrick, who they'd also brainwashed. For that tale, you can check out the story arc Shock to the System, which ran in Captain America number 11 to 14 in 2012. There have also been examples of other individuals adopting the Scourge identity, only to be quickly killed by the likes of the Punisher before accomplishing anything, which has happened at least twice. More recently, another man, Anthony Diaz, adopted the Scourge of the Underworld identity, donning a costume that was evocative of the original Scourge program, but I'll avoid spoiling the details of that story here. If you want to read that one for yourself, you can find it in the pages of Captain America number 15 to 18 from 2019 and 2020. In terms of legacy numbering, that's number 719 to 722, part of the Legend of Steve story arc by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Alright heroes, that is all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!